There's a moment most people never notice, but you have. It happens at the peak of something. The party is full. The event is exactly what it was supposed to be. Everyone around you is doing what they came to do, laughing, connecting, performing their best version of belonging. And you're standing in the middle of it, drink in hand, smile in place, and you feel it. Not sadness, not loneliness exactly, something quieter and stranger than either of those, a kind of internal stepping back, a part of you that watches the room from a slight remove, that registers the noise as noise, the performance as performance, the crowd as crowd, and feels no particular pull toward any of it. And then you go home, and something in you settles. Most people would call that a problem. A therapist might call it dissociation. A life coach would tell you to lean in. A well-meaning friend would say you just need to find the right people. Arthur Schopenhauer would call it the beginning of intelligence. Not intelligence as a score on a test, intelligence as a particular relationship with reality, a capacity to see through the agreed-upon fictions that hold social life together, to perceive the mechanism behind the performance, to register what is actually happening rather than what everyone has decided to pretend is happening. And once you can see that, once that kind of perception has switched on, the crowd stops being magnetic. It becomes, at best, background, at worst, a drain. This video is about what Schopenhauer understood about that experience, about why the intelligent person's instinct to step back from the crowd isn't failure, it's direction, and about where that direction, followed honestly, actually leads. It's not where you think. Let's start with something that sounds simple, but isn't. The crowd, every crowd, in every context, is not a collection of individuals who happen to be in the same place. It is an agreement, a shared hallucination, a collectively maintained fiction about what matters, what is worth wanting, what constitutes a good life, and what kind of person deserves to be admired. This fiction is extraordinarily powerful. It operates below the level of conscious choice. You don't decide to absorb the crowd's values. You simply exist inside them long enough, and they become the water you swim in. The things the crowd considers important start to feel intrinsically important. The things the crowd ignores start to feel genuinely negligible. The crowd's hierarchy of worth becomes, quietly and without announcement, your own. Schopenhauer saw this with the clarity of someone who had stepped entirely outside. He wrote, "The crowd gives the impression of a large animal that blindly follows its instincts, and this animal has no idea where it is going." No idea where it is going. Not lost exactly, just moving, driven by appetite and habit and the momentum of what everyone else is doing, without any individual within it having chosen the direction. Think about the last time you genuinely chose something, not because it was expected, not because it was what people like you were supposed to want, not because the crowd's approval was attached to it, but because you, in the quiet of your own judgment, decided it was worth wanting. How long ago was that? For most people, honest reflection on this question is uncomfortable because most of what we call our desires are not ours at all. They are the crowd's desires, absorbed so completely and so early that they carry the feeling of personal conviction without any of its substance. The philosopher René Girard, building unknowingly on ground Schopenhauer had already mapped, called this mimetic desire, the tendency to want things not for their intrinsic value, but because others want them. prestige, status, the right possessions, the admired career, the validated relationship. These are not things people want because they have genuinely reflected on what would make their specific life meaningful. They are things people want because wanting them is what the crowd does. The intelligent person, and here Schopenhauer is precise about what he means by intelligent, is not necessarily the one who scores highest on measurable tests. The intelligent person is the one who has developed enough inner life to perceive the distinction between genuine desire and borrowed desire, between what they actually value and what they have been handed to value. This perception is the first escape. Not dramatic, not announced, not a manifesto posted on a wall, just a quiet internal moment where the crowd's authority loses its grip, where the question, "But is this actually what I want?" surfaces and doesn't immediately answer itself with whatever the crowd would say. That question is the crack in the wall. Everything that follows in this video is about what you find on the other side of it.
To understand why the crowd is so difficult to escape, you have to understand the engine that keeps you inside it. And that engine is not, as most people assume, social pressure. Social pressure is just the visible surface. The real engine runs deeper. It runs in the biology Schopenhauer spent his entire philosophical career trying to name and describe. He called it the will. Not your will, not free will, not willpower. The will. His word for the blind, purposeless biological force that drives every living thing toward desire, acquisition, reproduction, and survival. The force that generates want after want after want with the mechanical indifference of an engine that doesn't know and doesn't care where it's taking you. Schopenhauer wrote, "Willing and craving is its whole essence. It is a blind, incessant impulse, a dark, dumb impulse that drives all nature, including the nature you call yourself." A dark, dumb impulse, not a noble striving, not an expression of your unique self, a biological mechanism operating through you, using the story of your individuality as its vehicle. Here is why this matters for the crowd. The crowd is the will's most efficient delivery system. When you exist inside a crowd, inside a culture, an economy, a social group with shared values and visible hierarchies, the will has a ready-made menu of desires to generate in you. Look at what others have, want it, acquire it, display it. Watch others want what you now have. Your status rises. A new menu appears. The cycle restarts. This is not cynicism. This is description. The entire machinery of modern consumerism, social media, status competition, and career aspiration operates on exactly this mechanism. It is the will wearing the costume of personal achievement. Psychologists call what happens after each acquisition hedonic adaptation. You get the thing. The wanting subsides, briefly, then returns, recalibrated to a new target. The promotion you worked 3 years for stops feeling significant within months. The relationship that was supposed to complete you becomes ordinary. The life you built stops feeling like enough. Not because you are ungrateful, because the will was never interested in satisfaction. It was only ever interested in the next want. The crowd accelerates this cycle to maximum velocity. Everyone around you is wanting, acquiring, displaying, comparing. The social mirrors you are surrounded by constantly reflect new things to want, new levels to reach, new ways to fall short. The will, which is already relentless, now has infinite external fuel. The intelligent person begins to see this mechanism, not always clearly at first, usually as a vague dissatisfaction, a suspicion that the things they're chasing won't deliver what they seem to promise.
But over time, with enough honest observation of their own experience, the pattern becomes undeniable. You pursued the thing the crowd said would satisfy you. You got it. It didn't. And the crowd was already pointing at the next thing. Schopenhauer's question, the one that changes everything, is this: what would happen if you stopped following the pointer?
There is a cost to living inside the crowd's agreement that goes deeper than unfulfilled desire. It does something to the self, something gradual, quiet, and, if you have never looked at it directly, almost invisible. The crowd demands conformity not just of behavior, but of perception. To belong, to maintain your position inside the collective agreement, you must not only do what the crowd does, you must, over time, see what the crowd sees, value what the crowd values, filter your experience through the crowd's interpretive lens. This requires a specific internal operation that most people perform thousands of times a day without noticing. Every time you have a genuine perception, a thought, an observation, a feeling that doesn't align with what the crowd around you would approve, you make a micro-decision. Do you follow it, or do you suppress it, reshape it, translate it into something more acceptable? Most people, most of the time, suppress. Not through cowardice necessarily, through habit, through the accumulated social training of a lifetime, through the knowledge absorbed early and deeply that differentness is costly and conformity is rewarded. Schopenhauer named this process with characteristic directness. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Read that again, not the most dramatic form, the most common form. Despair as the baseline condition of a life lived performing someone else's version of yourself. Not acute suffering, not the kind that announces itself and demands attention. The quiet, pervasive, low-grade suffering of a self that has been edited down to something the crowd can accept. Most people don't recognize this as suffering because they have nothing to compare it to. They have never lived an unedited version of themselves. They have been shaping themselves to the crowd's requirements for so long that the original shape is no longer visible, even to them. The intelligent person, the person this video is addressed to, will recognize this, not necessarily because they have escaped it completely, but because they have felt it. The friction between what they actually perceive and what the crowd permits them to say they perceive. The gap between their genuine response to an experience and the response they perform. The quiet exhaustion of maintaining a version of themselves that is acceptable but not true. Modern psychology has documented what happens to people who sustain this performance long-term. Research on what psychologists call self-concept clarity, the degree to which a person has a clear, stable, internally consistent sense of who they are, shows a direct correlation with psychological well-being. High clarity, lower anxiety, better resilience. Low clarity, the fractured, crowd-shaped self, correlates with depression, chronic stress, and a pervasive sense of emptiness. Schopenhauer would not have been surprised. He understood that the self, like any living thing, needs room, needs air, needs the freedom to be what it actually is, rather than a performance of what it is supposed to be. The crowd doesn't offer this. Only one thing does. This is the chapter where most philosophical discussions take a wrong turn. Having established that the crowd is a shared fiction, that the will keeps you trapped inside it, that sustained conformity costs the self something irreplaceable, the natural conclusion most people reach is escape, leave, withdraw, build the walls higher, thin the social obligations, exit as many arenas as possible. This is not what Schopenhauer means, and it is not what genuine escape looks like. Here is the distinction that matters. There are two ways to be outside the crowd.
The first is reactive distance. You pull back because the crowd has hurt you, disappointed you, failed to give you what you needed. You build isolation out of pain and call it independence. You mistake the absence of engagement for the presence of freedom. This is not escape. This is the crowd still defining you, now by negation rather than conformity. You are still organized around it. You are simply standing at the opposite pole. The second is what Schopenhauer actually points toward. He called it, in the language of his time, aesthetic contemplation, the capacity to step outside the will's agenda entirely. Not to run from the crowd, to become genuinely indifferent to it, to be in the world, among people, engaged with life, but no longer governed by the crowd's hierarchy of what matters. He wrote, "Genius is the ability to leave personal interest, will, and aims entirely out of sight in order to remain pure knowing subject. Pure knowing subject. Not a reactor, not a performer, not a competitor, a perceiver. Someone whose primary mode of engaging with reality is seeing it clearly rather than managing it for social advantage. This is a radical reorientation, and it cannot be faked. You cannot decide to be indifferent to the crowd's opinion while still secretly caring what it thinks. You cannot perform nonconformity. That is just a different costume in the same theater. The escape Schopenhauer describes is not a pose. It is the result of a genuine interior shift that takes time, honesty, and repeated confrontation with the question, what do I actually think, feel, and value, as distinct from what the crowd has handed me to think, feel, and value. The practical shape of this shift looks, from the outside, unremarkable. The person who has made it still goes to the dinner, still attends the meeting, still navigates social obligations with sufficient grace that nothing explodes. But inside, the organizing principle has changed. They are no longer asking, how do I appear? They are asking, what is actually true here? They are no longer optimizing for approval. They are optimizing for clarity. This is the escape that isn't running. Not away from the crowd, through it, carrying a different question than everyone else in the room, and being genuinely and fundamentally untroubled by the fact that no one else can see what you see.
Let's get concrete, because everything up to this point is diagnosis, useful diagnosis, necessary diagnosis. But the question that matters now is, what do you actually do with the space that opens up when the crowd's grip loosens? Schopenhauer's answer, and it is not the answer most people expect from the philosopher famous for pessimism, is you build an interior life. Not as a consolation prize for the social life you're not having, not as a retreat from the world, as the primary project, as the thing that was always the point underneath all the noise. He wrote, "A man can do as he wills, but not will as he wills." You cannot choose your biology. You cannot choose the will that drives you, but you can choose what you attend to. You can choose where your consciousness goes when it is not being conscripted by the crowd's demands. And in that choice, repeated daily across a lifetime, you build something the crowd cannot touch. What does this look like in practice? 3 things. First, the cultivation of genuine taste. Not taste as social signaling, not the curated aesthetic that tells others who you are, but taste as the slow, private development of your own honest responses to art, ideas, music, literature, nature. Learning what actually moves you, as distinct from what is supposed to move you. This requires time alone, sustained attention, and the willingness to have unpopular responses to things. Second, the development of a thinking practice. Not productivity, not self-optimization, thinking, the kind that doesn't have a deliverable, that follows a question wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination is useful.
Schopenhauer spent his life doing this. He sat, he walked, he read voraciously, and wrote with extraordinary density. He built, over decades, a philosophical system that tried to see the whole of human experience clearly. You don't need to write a philosophical treatise, but the practice of thinking past the point where it becomes comfortable, of following a real question into real difficulty, this is the interior life's primary activity. Third, the tolerance of not being understood. This is the one most people underestimate. The interior life, by definition, is not fully communicable. What you build inside cannot be entirely transferred to another person, displayed for approval, or validated by consensus. It exists for you. Its value is intrinsic and private. And the crowd, which measures everything by its external returns, will not recognize it as valuable. You have to be okay with that. Not performatively okay, not "I don't care what people think" as a social statement, actually okay, grounded enough in the reality of what your interior life is and what it gives you, that the crowd's inability to see it doesn't diminish it in your own eyes. This is the work, quiet, slow, unglamorous, and entirely yours. Schopenhauer called it the only life worth living. He wasn't wrong.
Here is the part of this conversation that most people either skip or get wrong. The escape from the crowd is not a destination. You do not arrive at a permanent state of serene detachment from which you observe human folly with calm, untroubled wisdom. That is a fantasy. And chasing it is just another form of the will's game, another thing to want, another level to reach, another way to feel like you haven't quite gotten there yet. The reality is more ordinary, and in its ordinariness, more genuinely achievable. The crowd will still be there. Most of the people in your life will still be operating inside its agreement. The social pressures, the status hierarchies, the mimetic desires, the performances of belonging, none of this disappears because you have understood its mechanism. You will still encounter it daily. You will still, on some days, feel its pull. You will still occasionally catch yourself wanting something because someone else has it. This is the will. It doesn't retire. What changes is not the crowd. What changes is your relationship to your own reactions. Schopenhauer was, in his personal life, famously contradictory on this point. He wrote with contempt for the pursuit of social approval and was known to be deeply wounded when his work was ignored. He argued for the superiority of solitude and regularly dined in the best Frankfurt restaurants, preferred the company of his poodle named World Soul, and enjoyed the recognition that came to him late in life. He was not perfectly above the crowd. He was human. And this is perhaps his most useful lesson, not the one he explicitly taught, but the one his life demonstrated. You do not need to be free from the crowd's pull to live well. You need to be conscious of it. You need to be able to see it operating, name it when it moves you, and choose, not always, but often enough, whether to follow it or not. He wrote, "The greatest achievements of the human mind are generally received with distrust at first." He knew this from experience. He wrote in relative obscurity for decades. He watched lesser thinkers receive the recognition he believed his work deserved. He was not unmoved by this, but he kept working. He kept writing. He stayed with the interior project even when the crowd couldn't see it. That is the model. Not transcendence, not immunity, not the permanent escape. The daily practice of returning to your own center of gravity, your own honest perception, your own genuine values, your own interior life, even when the crowd's pull is strong. Some days you succeed,
Some days you drift. Both are part of it. The point is not perfection. The point is direction. Accept it. The crowd will always exert pressure. Accept it. Accept it. You will sometimes feel it. Accept it. Accept the work is returning again and again to what is actually yours. Accept it. And in that returning, repeated, imperfect, honest, something accumulates that the crowd can never give you and can never take away.
Here is what all of this points toward. The crowd is not your enemy. It never was. The crowd is a mirror, an imperfect, distorting, relentlessly flattering, and relentlessly punishing mirror that shows you what you look like from the outside while telling you nothing about what you are from the inside. Most people spend their entire lives managing their reflection in that mirror, adjusting, optimizing, trying to make the image look a certain way. And in that lifelong project of image management, something gets forgotten, something quiet and essential and entirely uninterested in its own reflection. The self that exists before the crowd's opinion of it. Schopenhauer believed and spent his life arguing that this self, accessed through honest introspection and genuine aesthetic and philosophical engagement, is where the only real satisfaction available to human beings actually lives. Not the will's satisfaction, the temporary cyclical relief of a desire met, something stiller than that, something he called at various points in his work the peace that surpasses all understanding, the condition of a mind that has stopped reaching, stopped performing, stopped measuring itself against the crowd's endlessly moving standard, and simply, for a moment, is. You cannot buy this, you cannot achieve it, you cannot earn it through discipline or accumulate it through productivity. You can only create the conditions for it. Quiet, honesty, the gradual, patient construction of an interior life that has enough substance to sustain you when the crowd's noise subsides. The intelligent person escapes the crowd not by leaving it, by outgrowing the need for its approval. Not once, not permanently, daily, in the small decisions, what to pay attention to, what to think about, what to value, what to let go, that accumulate, invisibly, into the person you actually become. The crowd will always be there, the noise will always be available, the mirror will always be ready to show you what you look like from the outside. But so will the silence. And in the silence, if you have done the work, if you have built something real inside the noise, you will find what the crowd was always promising and never delivering. Not happiness, not success, not belonging, something quieter, more durable, more entirely yours, yourself. If this video reached something genuine in you, not the part that wants to share it, not the part that wants to perform having understood it, but the actual quiet part underneath, then you already know what to do with it. Nothing yet. Sit with it. If this video found something true, write in the comments, "It made sense to me." No elaboration, no summary, no proof that you understood it correctly. Just those 5 words. You will know why they're enough. Subscribe if you want to go further into Schopenhauer, into Nietzsche, into the thinkers who took reality seriously and built something inside it that the crowd couldn't reach. We go deeper every week. The crowd will still be outside. Come back to yourself anyway.